Dylan, can you hear me?
Hey, I can, Matt. How you doing, dude?
I'm doing outstanding, brother.
Can you hear me okay? See me okay? Everything good on your end from my side?
Yes, sir.
All right. Just one second. All right, cool, dude. Thanks for being here. Thanks for doing this, man.
Oh, no problem. Pleasure's all mine, I assure you.
So as we kind of jump into the podcast, kind of explain what you do, give a little background on yourself and just kind of the situation we're in here doing the podcast for.
Sure. So I'll tell you a little summation about my life. Long story short, 2003, I graduated from the University of St. Thomas in Houston with a degree in history. And immediately afterwards, I enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. I did 4 years in the Marine Corps. I got out. I was in civilian life for a little while. I actually worked as a doorman at a couple of strip clubs in Houston. That job was pretty crazy. And then I went back into the military, except this time I went into the Army, where I went into U.S. military intelligence and I became an interrogator and a Category 2 human intelligence source handler. Did a couple deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. And my Iraq deployment, I was an interrogator. I actually interrogated one of the top insurgent leaders in Diyala province, Iraq, at one point in time. And when I deployed to Afghanistan in 2011, I was the non-commissioned officer in charge of the human intelligence shop for the 1st Stryker Brigade, 25th Infantry Division. I got out of the Army in early 2012, it was about March 2012. And I went back over to Afghanistan working as a contractor for the Department of Defense for a number of years, working for different private defense firms, Mission Central Personnel, CACI, CACI, SOCI, 6-3 Systems. And I was in Afghanistan as a contractor for about an additional 5 years. My last 2 years in, I worked on a strategic intelligence clandestine platform, which I can't really say much about. Much of what we did was highly, highly classified. And then I left Afghanistan near the end of 2015, and I went to work in Southeastern Europe as a counterintelligence analyst for US Army Europe. My job there was to root out double agents that certain hostile intelligence services had placed in our human intelligence operations, while while also making sure that these same intelligence services did not penetrate any of our existing operations. Did well doing that for about 6 years, got a few scalps on my belt. And then my position was recently cut, but I managed to write 6 different books. Some were novels, some were novellas. I'm also marketing those now. But I'm back in the States now, sort of doing that, taking it easy, trying to get on a number of podcasts just to try to give not just a historian's perspective on things, but also an intelligence analyst perspective on things that'll allow me to explain to people, more what's going on behind the scenes, the history behind it, why the intelligence community does what it does, why it looks at certain things the way it does. And eventually I'll be going back to work in the intelligence business. But for the meantime, I'm here to, obviously work on marketing my books, but also go on podcasts and discuss various issues.
Man, that's a lot to unload here. So I got a couple of things that you mentioned here, and I want to kind of get a little
Sure.
bit more of a background on. So you mentioned you were an interrogator. So kind of
Correct.
what were the duties of that? What did that involve being an interrogator?
So when people hear interrogator, the first thing they sometimes think about is stuff like waterboarding or ripping some guy's fingernails out. And that's for people on the conventional military side, it's just not the case. So my job as an interrogator when I was in Diyala province in 2009 was to sit down with insurgents or insurgent leaders, HVIs, high value individuals, insurgent leaders we caught that we thought had a lot of knowledge about how these different networks were working, how the IEDs were being brought in, which insurgent group was working with Al Qaeda in Syria, which was working with Iran, that sort of thing. My job was to basically sit down with them and do everything I could to extract information from them, get them to willingly talk to us and give certain pieces of information up that would allow us to target those networks and kinetic operations, or do things like ascertain where IEDs were, where IEDs were coming from, to basically save American lives. And those are the two general areas that what I did was focused on.
Okay, so this is gonna sound maybe a little childish or dumb when I say this because I'm going to this completely blind. I know nothing about any of the insides of military except for the books that I've read. But when you're sitting down with these leaders and you're saying, hey, let's come to a compromise, let's do this, let's do that. Is there any type of fear going on inside of your head at the time of your just interrogating these leaders that are probably more powerful than anybody you could ever imagine?
Well, I was never really afraid of those guys. One, I had in my own prison facility. If they got out of line and did anything stupid, I had an MP that would just, split their head if they got out of line. They tried to kill me or anything. But these insurgent leaders were, they were reasonably powerful. But at the end of the day, I mean, we still had a lot more firepower than they did. So that wasn't really much of a concern, to be honest. Now, where there was a little bit of fear was, okay, at the time I was a new interrogator. Yeah, I was just trying to get my feet wet. This is before I was finally cutting my teeth, as we say, doing the job for real. And sometimes you could get these guys to talk to you, sometimes you couldn't. And in those cases where you weren't able to get a guy to talk, or you were not able to extract the information, the commanders on the ground needed to shoot the insurgents or to save American lives, I often went to bed wondering, okay, I failed to extract the information. Is some American soldier, sailor, Marine, cavalry, scout, whatever, going to lose their lives or lose their legs because I failed to do the job good enough? Even though my squad leader said, hey, Reed, you did a good job, man. Just go with the guy again tomorrow. So that worry and that fear was always in the back of my head. And after a while, I had to learn to just compartmentalize my thoughts and not think about it too much. If I did, it would have drove me crazy.
You also mentioned intelligence operator. You described it a little bit. Is that kind of like a spy, kind of like you're trying to see what's happening here and there without being noticed?
Sure. So, on the human intelligence side, here's what it was for those of us in the conventional forces of the military. Some of it was pretty straightforward. So, when I got back from Iraq, I was allowed to attend a course called the Source Operations course the Army runs at Fort Huachuca. That's basically where they teach you tradecraft, counter surveillance, surveillance detection methodologies. They basically teach you how to go into a foreign country, meet people, whether they're, organized crime, insurgent leaders, or criminals who have access to information that the US military and policymakers in Washington, D.C. basically need to know to protect the country. And they train you to meet with those people, figure out what they're like, what are their wants, their worries, their fears, what are their motivations for doing certain things. If you've got a terrorist leader in a foreign country and you meet with a guy in organized crime who really hates that terrorist leader and has a motivation revenge, you sit down, you say, hey man, you really want to get, douchebag over their back? Well, hey, I work for the Americans. Maybe we can work together and make it happen. And it's kind of an oversimplification, but that would be kind of what we would do, whether that would be working out of an embassy or attached to a conventional unit where we go out and we greet civilians in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we have ways of looking for people who we think have access to information we know. Hey man, is your neighbor Abdul, is he the guy making those IEDs that are blowing our guys up? Then you find out, oh yeah, he just happens to hate his neighbor because his neighbor shot one of his goats or something to that effect. And then you try to use that as a way to exploit and play on, get the guy to work for us to give us the information we need. And where the more tradecraft oriented stuff comes in is oftentimes when you're operating at a higher level, maybe in a foreign country where you're not in uniform, maybe you're in civilian clothes, and you're out running operations where there are people out there looking to stop you from doing it. Other counterintelligence people who do sort of like what I did. Other people in other countries are going to try to have their people who do what I do stop our guys from doing, what they're also trying to do to us. So that's kind of the summation of the human intelligence side of things. Now, there's different layers of it. The really high level human intelligence operations, there's additional training courses you have to go through to be certified to do those. If you ever saw the movie Red Sparrow, uh, the Russian girl played by Jennifer Lawrence, she would be a more senior level source. You would have to be a graduate of a course like the Field Tradecraft course, which is what the CIA runs at Camp Perry, Virginia. We call that the farm. And Joel Edgerton's character in the movie Red Sparrow would have been a graduate of that course for him to have actually run in the movie, in the book, Dominika Egorova as his source. So that's kind of how the human intelligence side of things works.
Okay. But that's how the human intelligence side works. How does the Russian intelligence? How does that work? Since we're right there in the same ballpark.
Oh, that is where things get interesting. So they do a lot of the same stuff we do. The human intelligence operations they run, in terms of basic principle, they're not really that different. And they're not necessarily better than us. We tend to run better long-term human intelligence operations because we play on long-term motivations, relationships, partnerships. The Russians, they're really, really big on doing things like threatening and blackmail. Okay, give you an example. So back during the Cold War, when we would have embassy employees, for example, on an airplane flying to the embassy in Moscow to go start their new job with the State Department, or the Marine Guards going there to be part of the Marine Security Detachment. They might be on a plane. It'd be an Aeroflot, a Russian airline, obviously. And some smoking hot Russian chick would just sit beside them. And they usually did this little trick here if they thought the American subject was married. That hot Russian chick would plant a big kiss on the guy's mouth, grab his crotch, and then take his hand and put his hand on one of her breasts. And then one of the stewardesses who's working for the Russian intel service, because pretty much all of them were, would take pictures of that. And what the Russians would try to do is say, "Oh, comrade, you don't want us to show picture to wife? Maybe you get this piece of information, then we burn picture. What do you say?" They try to do stuff like that. Or they do more, how shall I say, insidious sexploitation. They'll just try to get a guy in a bad position and they'll bring in a stripper or something who maybe is like an underage girl and they have proof she's underage. And then they say, "Hey, if you don't work for us, we're going to give this to, your criminal investigation division or your FBI and get you thrown in jail." That's the kind of thing the Russians would do. Now, that can work very well for a very short period of time. But if a guy is being forced to betray his country and you're blackmailing him into doing it, he's going to hate your guts. And eventually, that creates an opening for the other intelligence services to say, "Hey, you want to get those Russians back? We'll push all this other stuff aside." And then that allows us to go to that American who's being blackmailed and maybe give him disinformation to give to the Russians. Okay. And the stuff kind of goes back and forth. So, there's some basic rules and guidelines that stay the same, even though we kind of operate a little bit differently. Give you a good example of how the Russians can play dirty when you really, really piss them off. This is a story not too many people have heard. So you might be too young to remember this, but back around 1984, our CIA chief of station, Bill Buckley, was kidnapped in Beirut, Lebanon. He was the chief of station in Beirut, a former U.S. Marine officer, I believe. Was friends with President Reagan, if I'm not mistaken. And the people who kidnapped him were a splinter group from Hezbollah, one of the terrorist groups there in Lebanon. And
Right.
yeah, they demanded that we pay a ransom. And President Reagan was afraid they'd kill him. So he told the CIA and the State Department, just pay the damn ransom. So they paid the ransom and they dropped his, shot up, mutilated corpse outside of our embassy, took the money and said, "Ha ha." Well, about the same time, this splinter group from Hezbollah kidnapped a Russian diplomat. and they went bragging about it on CNN and a few television channels, and then talking about how the Russians were godless heathens for what they were doing in Afghanistan. And when that CNN broadcast aired, it just so happened that a senior Russian KGB official named Vladimir Kroichkov was watching the television and saw that, put his vodka down, and let's just say he was not in a very happy mood. He was not a happy camper. So he called in the deputy head of the Russian GRU, his underlings in the KGB, and he says, these guys think they can kidnap one of our diplomats and get away with it. We're going to show them what happens when they do that. So they sent some of their Spetsnaz goons down there to Beirut to try to teach this guy a lesson. Well, the guy in question was one of the mullahs who worked, one of the religious leaders of Hezbollah. They knew where his mosque was, but they couldn't nail down where the guy was because this particular mullah had spent half his life dodging the Israelis, so he was really, really hard to track. Well, this mullah had a brother-in-law. So the Russians kidnapped his brother-in-law, killed him, sawed his head off, cut his balls off, put his head and his balls in a burlap sack, and they dropped it outside the doorstep to his mosque. When the mullah bad guy comes up and undoes the burlap sack, he sees the testicles and severed head of his brother-in-law. And there's a note driven to his forehead with a brass nail that has Russian KGB sword and shield lettering on it. And in Cyrillic Russian letters and Arabic, it says, give us our diplomat back and don't you ever threaten us again. Needless to say, the Russians soon had their diplomat back, and the Iranians made a formal apology saying, oh, we should keep these guys under control. We're really sorry, guys. Please don't get mad at us. Because the Iranians and the Russians didn't always get along. The Russians threatened to nuke them at one point in time. So that was how the Russians dealt with that particular issue. And I've seen them work in other places overseas. There's certain things they're really good at, like subversion. I can talk a little bit about that if you want.
Yeah, sure, sure. What
Okay.
I just want to say something real quick. You
Sure.
mentioned, about the Russians, and basically they're there for exploitation and blackmail. That's how their intelligence service works versus the US, which is kind of like, we're gonna do anything to get information, yada yada yada. So they're pretty much to the point of, if you don't do this, I'm gonna send all these pictures to everybody in the whole entire world if you don't do what I say. That reminds me of um a show that was on Netflix. I can't think of the name of it, but there was an episode in particular where the president of the United States gets word that his people are trapped in a foreign country. And in order for him to get them back, he has to have sex with a live pig on live national television.
Black
And
Mirror.
Black Mirror, that's it. And I wonder, is that kind of the same situation where you could be stuck in if you're versed in one of those, other country? I don't even know. I don't even know how to question that. But obviously you saw it. You saw the Black Mirror. You knew what it was. Does that seem like something that could possibly happen, or does it seem like a legit situation, even though it was a fake story?
Well, the whole screwing the pig thing, I don't see that happening. The Russians wouldn't waste time on that. If they were going to do something like that, they'd be demanding some piece of information in return, or they'd be demanding an avenue to allow them to engage in long-term subversion. Which, when you think of spy operations, you look at the Russian intelligence services. At least back in the Cold War, the majority of their budget didn't go to intelligence collection or even the blackmailing we were talking about. It mostly went to long-term subversion. I can't go into too much detail. I saw the Russians engage in this sort of thing in parts of Eastern Europe and the Balkans, and boy, were they good at it. They kind of sometimes had us in a bit of a pickle. But an example, um, back in the 1970s, we were trying to do a crash program to replace our fossil fuels for electricity generation with nuclear power plants. Other Western countries would probably have followed suit. The only country that was successful in that regard was France. The reason the US, Canada, and Germany failed so horribly in trying to build out our nuclear power infrastructure, you had the anti nuclear weapons, anti nuclear power movement, but there were large chunks of that movement that were Russian subversion operations, possibly with Russian sleeper cells. So basically, yeah, their subversion was so effective within the US and the West that they shut down the nuclear power movement. Now, the reason they did that is the only export the Russians could make money off of in the Cold War was exported oil and gas, which a lot of Western countries bought. Had we built out our nuclear power structure in Japan, Canada, the US, and Germany, that could have been economically a crippling blow to them. So they used long term subversion, sleeper agents, like you see on that show, The Americans. That's how they fanned the flames of it. And so when we realized what they'd done, it was kind of like an electric shock to the balls for the intelligence community and the national security establishment of the United States. And so President Reagan comes into power in 1981, and the decision is made, we're going to bring the Russians to their freaking knees. And the way we did it was pretty simple. So there was a major conventional military buildup to make sure that if we went to war against them, that we could defeat them conventionally in Europe without having to resort to nukes. That was part one. Two was a Star Wars defense. There were other purposes for that. But the next big step that doesn't get talked about a lot is the Reagan administration worked with the Saudis to crash oil prices. That brought oil and gas prices way down in the US, helped us, get our economy going a lot faster. But by crashing the oil prices, we financially crippled the Soviet Union, such that by 1987, they were more or less on their knees just trying to pretend that they weren't. And that's what helped speed up their collapse and just brought the whole structure crashing down. So there's how you see the Russian subversion operation, but then our strategic retaliation against that brought them right to their knees.
Hmm. You mentioned a lot about spies, and
Mhm.
I want to know when I picture a spy, I think honestly James Bond. That's who
Mhm.
I think of when I think of a spy. So spies and military versus like a I guess a governmental British spy like James Bond. What are kind of compare and contrast the two?
So you see James Bond always driving around in sports cars with hot chicks, Mercedes, BMWs, Porsches, Bugattis, whatever. Always in a suit and tie, martini shaken, not stirred, wax a bunch of people. For the spies, that's not how it is. All that stuff will draw a lot of attention to you and make you stand out. Okay. A better example would be, let's see, what would be a good, let's say that I'm working in a country like, let's say Romania, just, for argument's sake, we'll say we're in Romania. And we know the Russians have an embassy there. And we have a list of all the embassy employees. We know who the military attache is. And we know they have access to information we want. So if I'm the spy, what I might do is just go hang out at some of the bars, elicit information, get to talking to the guy, get him a little drunk and see maybe he starts talking trash about his boss. I say, oh man, you really don't like Colonel Yuri Gromov, do you, Sasha? Oh man, that sucks. You maybe try to befriend the guy for a while. It takes time. And then you find out he's got a wife who's suffering and needs surgery that he can't get in Russia, but can only get in the West. And when you find that out, that's when you sit down and you maybe make what we call, a pitch. Say, hey, man, this is who I am. I can get your wife surgery in the US. This is what I need you to do for me. And you hate your boss anyway, right? And if he agrees to work, that goes up in report. I take that back to the boss, whether that's an army colonel who's working for the DIA, or if you're CIA, it'll be the chief of station. Say, okay, we're going to give you permission to run this guy. And then I maybe tell, Sasha, Captain Sasha, whatever. I say, okay, from now on, here's where we're going to meet. If anybody asks why you're meeting me in this casino or whatever, here's what you tell them. Okay. And maybe we set up some embassy functions where we say, hey, we're going to invite all military officers from different embassies at this big party. Then he has a reason to be at the party. Then I tell him, hey, when you go into the men's room, I want you to take the packet information on that, whatever, that new Russian jet fighter. I want you to stick it up in the rafters and take a pencil and make a little X mark on it. Okay, it's amateur stuff. This is an idea of the trade craft. Okay, then I go in the men's room, pick it up, I walk out, stuff it in my shirt, and then I bring back to the embassy blueprints to a Russian jet fighter. Very oversimplification, but that's a more realistic version of how it might work versus a lot of the nonsense you see in the James Bond movies.
Right. And you mentioned something that I've always been interested in and didn't think about until you mentioned it when you were like, if you give me this information, I can find your wife's surgery in America. Now, let's just say this particular person gives you the information that you need that leads you to XYZ, wherever that leads you. The guy that gave you the information, is there any luck in getting what you told him would happen if he told you happen, or are you just kind of just saying that kind of like feeding the intuitive mind? Like, does that ever happen? I don't know if my
So,
question is making sense.
well, so when usually in situations like that, if we tell what we call a source, we're going to do something for you, we bend over backwards to do
Okay.
it. We're not a bunch of shysters like some people say. If people are going to risk their lives to bring us information, you're taught whatever your spy school is, whether it's the field tradecraft course, one of the more advanced defense courses, or source operations course. If you tell a source you're going to do something, one, make sure it's something you can actually get done. And then if it is, two, you bend over backwards to make it happen, because you may want the guy to continue to provide you information. And if you don't
Right.
do what you said you were going to do, that source is going to dry up. And then you got to go explain to, maybe a captain, a colonel, or someone in Washington, D.C., why you screwed this thing up. And your career isn't going to be on too good of a track after that.
Right. Cool, man. So as we kind of wind down here, I got a couple more questions for you. Um, Here's kind of a fun one, and we'll end on a very kind of a more serious note. All the military films and movies that has been released throughout the entirety of movie making, in your opinion, because you mentioned you're an historian, you obviously know the military like the back of your hand. What is the most accurate military film that has ever been released or that you have at least seen?
There's actually a few that
Okay.
would fall into that category. Um, as far as realistic depiction of Marine Corps boot camp, it's Full Metal Jacket,
Ah, okay.
bar none. They had a real Marine DI on there. I've had that experience, and the Marine Corps, they do some sadistic stuff at boot camp, but there's a reason for it. And there's, the reason why when you've done 4 years in the Marine Corps, if you go into any other branch of service, you don't ever have to do their basic training again, because the Marine Corps is recognized throughout the military as being good for life. So there's that. Saving Private Ryan, very realistic combat depictions, which Hollywood movies are getting a lot better about that now. They bring a lot more veterans on as advisors. Another great one was Fury. There's some great depictions in there of how armor piercing shells actually work, where they use what we call the Monroe effect, a shape charge. When I was in the Marine Corps, I was an anti-tank assault man. So blowing up tanks with missiles was my specialty. So I had to know how these things worked. But if you watch some of the scenes in the movie Fury, when they hit those German Tiger tanks with armor
Mhm.
piercing shells, or the Sherman gets hit, you see what looks like a jet of lava shoot
Mhm.
through the tank. That's because a shaped charge focuses the explosive force into a tiny area about the size of a big quarter or maybe a small nickel, and blows right through the tank, and it melts the tank armor as it goes through. We call that the chunky salsa effect. And it looks like a high-speed lava jet that just blows that molten stuff through and just causes all hell to break loose inside the tank. The actual tank won't blow up. So the scenes in the movie Fury for those are pretty damn realistic. And then the machine gun fire with the tracers going all over the place, and you see what look like little bitty different colored laser bolts going through the air. Those are called tracers. There's usually one of those for every 5 bullets on average, every 3 or 5. So the amount of tracers you see, multiply that times 3 or sometimes 5. That's how many bullets. They can tell how many bullets are actually in the air. And the way it shows it, making a snapping sound as it goes over your head, because most bullets are supersonic. They actually break the sound barrier as they go through the air. So those are pretty realistic. And then the movie Gladiator had some realistic scenes in it when it showed how the Roman legions were actually arrayed in battle. The armor, all the stuff that they wore, the weaponry was pretty accurate. The tactical setups were accurate. Um, they did a pretty good job on that. And so there actually are a lot of good movies out there. And then my years of experience in the military and in the intelligence community obviously gave me different, maybe more accurate perspectives on those things.
Mhm.
And then it also helped me put a lot of good material into the books that I wrote. And for example, one of my most recent books was called The Time Killers, and it's a military sci-fi time travel thriller about a group of military intelligence operatives who are Gen Xers like me, and they have to go back in time starting in the year 2027 after a war between the US and China. They have to go back in time to the late 80s, early 90s around Houston to basically assassinate four people to stop the aftermath of a future war between the US and China. And it got a lot of good stuff in there. It's like kind of like Stranger Things, the late 80s, early 90s, music, fashion, culture. Put some really good graphic love scenes in there. But I had to actually submit that book to the Department of Defense to get it cleared for publication. And when I submitted it to them almost a year and a half ago, I thought for sure they were going to redact like at least 4 or 5 pages worth of the material that I had. But turns out they did not redact any of it. The Pentagon looked at it. I believe they may have had the Department of Energy and the Air Force OSI folks at one of our military installations in the Southwest. I may or may not have mentioned that they looked at it, and then it came back and said, "Hey, you're cleared to go ahead and publish it." And I've got one other book, I wrote another draft manuscript, actually not an actual book, that I've sent to them for publication approval. So that book's actually doing pretty good. And I actually got a counterterrorism thread that's also out called In the Death of Night 2.0. It's gotten some really, really good reviews. And all my years in the Marine Corps, the Army, and in the intelligence community, those experiences made it so easy for me to write those books because in a lot of cases I could just sit down and write. I didn't necessarily have to think, okay, how is this guy gonna pull some counter surveillance techniques here? Oh, I know exactly how to do this, and I just type it up. So those experiences did quite a bit for me.
Last question for you, Matt, or Matthew, whichever you like to be called. Could there, and then this could be an open question. So, could there ever be a World War III? If so, what could possibly start this World War III? Now, I know that's an open-ended question because anything could start it, but in your mind, from what you've researched, could there ever be one? And if so, what could start this?
Come down to a number of things. I mean, it definitely could happen. So first, we'll start with the one that everyone's probably thinking about right now, the war in the Ukraine. So when we think about World War III, it may not necessarily be a mass nuclear exchange like we envisioned in the Cold War. It may be a series of blunders and engagements, probably like the first Peloponnesian War between the Spartans and the Athenians. It kind of nobody really planned for it to be a big war. They each thought they had it in the bag and they each made miscalculations. So right now, the Russian intelligence services are the ones pulling the strings. Okay, Putin's not really that much in charge. The Russian security services run that country and they're running the war. And in spite of the fact that they seem to be losing, and conventionally, yeah, they conventional since they are, getting their ass handed to them here and there, to achieve some of their strategic objectives, they don't necessarily have to win and occupy Ukraine, though they would like to. So all they have to do is do what they've done, which is wreck Ukraine's agriculture and destroy their import and export terminals and their port areas. Okay. Ukraine's a major bread basket, one of the biggest bread baskets on the planet. They're a massive exporter of fertilizer products, wheat, and grain. Okay. And the countries and parts of the world that are heavily, heavily dependent on those grain and food exports are in parts of the Middle East and all throughout Africa. So by destroying and wrecking Ukraine's agriculture and infrastructure, the Russian intel services hope to cause mass famine in parts of the Middle East, Turkey, and Africa. What that'll do is cause a lot of those countries to collapse into famine and civil war. Now, this is if nothing else changes. Unless something changes, here's what's liable to happen. They'll collapse those countries through famine and civil war. It'll drive tens of millions of refugees from Africa and parts of the Middle East right into the heart of Europe. Okay. Now, aside from the obvious chaos that causes, okay, financial strain, probably fighting wars and insurgencies on European soil, either the Europeans get overrun by those tens of millions of Muslim and African migrants and they capitulate, okay, which knocks out about half of NATO, which obviously Russia would like. The other option is that the other possibility is the right wing parties in Europe come back really, really hard, and then they strip off the lederhosen and put on the jackboots, and they do what Europeans are good at, and they basically turn them all into air pollution. Where that also becomes an issue is that a lot of the members of the right wing parties in parts of Europe, like France and Germany, are pro Russian and pro Putin. So the Russian intel services know exactly what they're doing there. So that could be a part of it. And how embroiled we get into that, if that World War III, kickoff scenario goes down, depends on how involved we want to get, or if we want to pull out and say, screw it. Other possibility is like the Peloponnesian War between the Athenians and the Spartans, we get more heavily involved in the Ukraine to bleed the Russians. Okay. And there's an argument to be made for that. It's not an illogical way to pursue it. Where we would have to be worried and be careful is some of the biggest and most devastating wars in history are not started through calculation. They're started through miscalculation. And if we make a wrong move and miscalculate when Putin's threatening to use nukes, that could very easily spiral out of control and end in some kind of a limited nuclear exchange. That's one possibility. Other place it could start would obviously be the Formosa Strait with Taiwan and China. And on the surface, it looks like China could just crush Taiwan. But remember, Taiwan's been preparing for a war with China for decades. The open-ended question is, can we be certain that the Taiwanese do not have their own nuclear weapons squirreled away somewhere? Now, let's say for argument's sake, the Chinese attack Taiwan, they crush them, and they're successful. And that scenario was actually mentioned in my book, The Time Killers, about how that might play out. But let's say the Chinese are successful. They cross Formosa, they crush Taiwan. The second those first Chinese Marines' boots hit the deck on Taiwan, you can bet South Korea and Japan are going to start building their own nuclear weapons, and they're going to get them built fast and point them right at China. What happens then? So you see, it's not like one big 24-hour nuclear exchange like in the Cold War and it's over, like movies like The Day After Tomorrow. It could be a series of slow burns where the various powers make miscalculations and it creates a chain of events that spirals out of control. That would be kind of the general path that I see things taking if it were to be a World War III scenario. Now, in the case of China, we have a lot of options to kick them in the balls and bring them to their knees, unbeknownst to most people. So China gets the vast majority of its oil from the Persian Gulf, right? It's 6,000 miles from the Persian Gulf to China. Most of China's naval vessels, according to geopolitical analyst Peter Zeihan, he's a great guy to talk to, by the way. I highly suggest you seek out Peter Zeihan and interview him. Great guy to interview. His analysis shows most of China's naval vessels cannot sail more than 1,000 miles. So all we would have to do is basically sink and blockade and embargo all the Chinese oil and gas tankers coming out of the Persian Gulf, and we've cut off most of their oil and a big chunk of their energy. And then right south of China, near the South China Sea, you have a place called the Straits of Malacca. And here's how I think this might go down. So China has to import vast amounts of raw materials to make the finished products they then have to export to get people to buy, right? Pretty simple. Well, most of what China imports and exports has to go through a place again called the Straits of Malacca. It's just it's a sea lane, but it's narrow and bottlenecked, and it's dotted with island archipelagos. If you look at this from an infantryman's perspective, it's nothing but ambush and choke points. And if you notice, the United States Marine Corps is getting rid of all of its artillery systems for their infantry units, and they're replacing them with long range anti ship missiles. And they're going to break the Marine battalions up into company size elements. What I think the Marine Corps is thinking about doing, if there's a war with China, is plopping platoon and company size elements all along those islands that make up our archipelago that surrounds the Straits of Malacca to sink all of China's shipping and basically choke off and constrict their main artery where they have to import raw materials and then export finished product. You do that, and you maintain the blockade long enough, you basically kill China. That's how I think that'll go down.
Man, that's a lot of information to to take in. But man, it's crazy to think there's a lot of stuff you think as just an outsider looking in. You think just because you watch CNN, you watch CBS, you look at social media, you think you have everything figured out until you actually look inside the lines and you realize, oh, there's a whole hell of a lot more going on than I'm even close to being aware of, you know?
Well, sure. I'll give you an example. You and your listeners will find this interesting. And I rolled up this little bit of history into the first novel I wrote. So during the Second World War, we had a serious espionage problem on American soil. The Germans and Italians had dozens of what were then called espionage cells all along Chicago, the Northeast, and the waterfront, because they knew in the event of a war with America, we'd be sending all of our men and material out and shipping out through those northeastern or eastern seaboard shipping ports. And when we declared war on Germany, British intelligence said, hey, there are hundreds of these espionage cells all along the eastern seaboard that are there to sabotage your refineries and your ports and your shipyards. And we were like, well, shit, how do we find these guys? Well, here's what we did. A group of naval intelligence officers got together with J. Edgar Hoover, the old FBI director, and they did something extremely ruthless and very ingenious. They cut a back alley deal with the mafia, with La Cosa Nostra, with guys like Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Sam Giancana. They said, look, guys, we're going to call a truce between you guys and the FBI. They said, you guys can run all your organized crime operations. We will leave you alone, do whatever you want to do. All you have to do for us is guarantee the security of our ports and refineries, which they could do because the unions worked those shipyards. And who controlled the unions? The mob. They said, guarantee the security of those areas, and then we're going to track down who the Italian and German spies are, and you're going to use mob hitmen to whack them and kill them. And the Italians, they got rid of pretty quick. Pretty much every Italian foreign exchange student that was living around Jersey and New York, when they went to work at whatever restaurant or pizza parlor they were working at, the mob showed up and said, hey, that kid from Italy, if you don't want us to torch your restaurant, you have him in the back alley and we're going to bash his head in and shoot him in the back of the head, kill him, whatever. And they take his body in the Hudson River or wherever and get rid of it. And that deal we made also created a vast human intelligence network for us on the island of Sicily, because everybody in Sicily worked and was related to someone in the mob. So we knew when the Germans were going to the bathroom, when they were eating chow. So we bombed Sicily. We bombed the German dining facilities when we knew most of the soldiers would be in there, as an example.
Mm-hmm.
And that human intelligence network the mob helped us set up is one of the reasons our invasion of Sicily was such a stunning success. So that was so effective that by 1943, the German Gestapo and the Italians would not allow their intel operatives to fly into a North American airport because they were dead 24 hours later. I mean, it was that effective. So I looked at that and I said, okay, I'm going to ramp it up a notch. So I wrote a book called In the Death of Night 2.0. It's about a retired CIA case officer running a private security firm in Houston, Texas, who manipulates and leverages a Russian organized crime syndicate and is slaughtering and killing Islamic terrorists all over Houston. The way he does it is pretty simple. His security firm has a contract to do what we call technical surveillance countermeasures work, or bug sweeping. He has a contract to do that for the Houston Police, Harris County, Immigration Customs, FBI, ATF, all those guys. And while he's supposed to be sweeping for bugs and listening devices, he has his people plant the devices they're supposed to be, listening for and sweeping for.
Mm-hmm.
And so he goes to the Russian mob and he says, look, I can tell you if, when, how, why, and where the cops and the feds are going to move on you way in advance on one condition. I got all this surveillance data on known or suspected Islamic terrorists living in and around Houston who are here to target our refining infrastructure here in the Gulf Coast in the event of a war. I'll keep the information on the cops and the feds coming. You just have all your ex-Spetsnaz, GRU, Stasi enforcers, and hitmen kill these guys and butcher them like hogs, make it nasty and violent, wherever it costs you to kill them. I spot you for in cold hard cash, unmarked bills from an offshore bank account my firm owns. And the Russians are not really able to turn the deal down because they've just had a lot of their, racketeering operations raided by the Houston police and the FBI. And so that's kind of what the crux of that particular book is about. And this being CIA case officer is a man named Bill Carpenter, one of the main characters in some other books. But that deal he does in The Death of Night 2.0 very closely reflects how we actually did business in World War II. And some big kind of nefarious deals like that, or say Project Paperclip, where we brought back Nazi scientists from World War II. A lot of that stuff is not conspiracy theory. I mean, it really does go on. And in defense of the intelligence community, we oftentimes do have good reasons for doing it, whether it's counterterrorism or maybe trying to counter something like nuclear weapons trafficking. These are the types of things that do go on behind the scenes for various good and bad reasons. And you read my books, you'll certainly get a little bit of a window into how some of these things are actually done and what some of the reasons are. But you're right, there's always so much more going on. What you see on the news, in some cases, either outright BS, or if you do get a piece of truthful information, it's just a small piece of what's really going on. It's like the tip of an iceberg. You're seeing a piece of the surface of the iceberg,
Mm-hmm.
but what's underneath it? Oh my God.
Yeah. Well, Matthew, look, man, we've been going for an hour. I've got plenty more questions to ask you. So I want to get you back on here the next couple of months.
Sure.
I'm going to keep my questions fresh. And I want to talk to you again. If you're cool with that, because I feel we could talk all day about these things just because I'm so curious about different things. And obviously you know your stuff. But man, I appreciate you coming on the podcast. Can they get your books on Amazon? Where can they find your books? I should ask that.
Well, sure. It's real simple. I just go on to Amazon, Amazon.com, Amazon.Canada, whatever, and just type in the titles of one of my books in my name. The best way would be to type in one of my more recent books. So just go into Amazon.com and a little search queue, select books, and just type in The Time Killers by Matthew Reed. Pull that book up and then click on my name. There's a little picture there with me in a black leather jacket and black sunglasses. Click on my name and it'll show you all the books I've written. You can click on and buy any of them anytime.
Matt, thank you very much for coming on the podcast, brother. Like I said, we're going to get you back on, but thanks for your time, and I hope my questions did you well. I hope the podcast did you well.
It did, brother. I sincerely appreciate you having me on. The pleasure is all mine. Whenever you want to have me back, just shoot me an email.
All right, man. You have a good one.
You do the same, brother. Take care. God bless.